Hey Foundry, we are in our fourth week on a series from the Old Testament book of Nehemiah, and we're using this story of a man who felt called to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and looking at the tensions of that story to help us think about what it means to rebuild our lives, our relationships, our priorities here in this particular moment. And every week that we've looked at this text, and today will be Nehemiah chapter 4, we'll look at it through the lens of a specific question that kind of frames that particular text. And today we want to look at the idea of what to do when things get real. And I mean like get real like in the sense of like the overwhelm. When the vision moves from this really good idea, this thing that someone should do something about, to the reality of carrying out that particular tension. In the third chapter, we saw in the second chapter and the third chapter, we saw the tension of Nehemiah moving and into Jerusalem and seeing the devastation that was taking place, the devastation of the trauma people had experienced, and trying to move them to a place of seeing themselves as part of the restoration. And as the fourth chapter opens in the first three verses, and take a look at it, like it points out that these two guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, who didn't like the work that was going to happen with the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem, it turns out are now going to actively oppose it. They're going to oppose it overtly, not just through the idea of like, well, hey, we agree to disagree. They are going to come at him, and they're going to come at the rebuilding of the wall. And what do we do when things get real? You ever had a moment like that where it just felt the weight of the reality of the thing that you were being asked to do or rebuild or reprioritize? It's paralyzing. Today marks our 9th year in the city of Baltimore. It's been a blast most of the time. It's been amazing most of the time, even when it hasn't been fun. God has used our story in tremendous ways, I think. But I remember July 31st before that August 1st, when we had raised money, when we had cast a vision, when we had scouted out locations in Baltimore that we thought we might want to live, when we had enrolled our kids in school, and there was so much excitement. And yet, as I went to bed on July 31st, that excitement turned to dread. And as the calendar flipped to midnight, the morning of August 1st, the day that we were moving in, as everyone else was excited for us, I have to confess to you, I felt a great weight kind of upon my chest because things got real. The possibility of failure. What happens if we raised all this money and this doesn't come about? What does it look like if my kids hate it here? What does it look like if? And I couldn't stop those things running in my mind. And as I think back in our 9 years, back to that August 1st, I want to look at Nehemiah chapter 4 and maybe think about this idea of what it means when things get real for you and for me in this moment. What do we do, and how do we navigate this in light of what we see from this 2,500-year-old story of someone else living into that tension? The first thing I would point out is the idea of purpose. That when things get real, Nehemiah comes back to his purpose. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but there's a lot of things out there that have a sense of purpose for you, right? Like when you search for something on Instagram and you suddenly start to find things being marketed to you that look like that particular product or thing, it's because someone out there sees you as a consumer. There are people in your life and your story who see you as maybe an object in a greater picture that they have for maybe a picture of their personal flourishing. And maybe the most ultimate question when things get real we can come back to is what is our purpose? For Nehemiah, that his purpose is not what Sanballat and Tobiah think of him. His purpose is not even what Artaxerxes thinks of him. Though certainly in all of the disruptions that this is kicking up, maybe that would be a thing in the back of his mind. The thing that he has to come back to, the thing Nehemiah's story shows us, is over and over what a life looks like when it's grounded in the ability to know who we belong to. Nehemiah's story is one that is rooted and anchored in not getting too complacent and comfortable, being a cupbearer to a king 800 miles away, to know that he belongs to God, that he's part of a greater story, and that he's being invited to walk into that. And so when we feel the reality of things getting real, it comes back again to our purpose. When I think back to 9 years ago, for me, that meant, just really having to unpack all of the pressures that I was facing through the signs of, hey, why am I feeling this pressure? Where did that come from? What false stories am I living into? And really having to reject some of those things in light of the sense of purpose I knew God was inviting me to. Number two, to process our pain and take it to God. We see a prayer again, which is something we see all throughout Nehemiah in chapter 4, verse 4, that is honest and rooted in the tension of the moment. And Nehemiah is not deflecting the reality that the opposition of Sanballat and Tobiah hurts. It does. He's not neglecting that there's a real pressure. There is. You ever met someone that you feel like they're invincible? You feel like nothing gets to them. You feel like they're Teflon, like nothing sticks to them. Like, it's hard to relate to a person like that, isn't it? Particularly when you compare what you know about them to what you think you know about them. But here's the reality. We can often run into the idea of thinking that people like that, they don't ever process, they don't feel anything. And the truth is, if they don't process things, they're actually approaching a world of trouble, because what you don't process, you're going to end up projecting. If you don't process your anger, it will turn to bitterness and rage. If you don't process your fear and anxiety, it can paralyze and cripple and create panic. If you don't process the ways in which we escape or medicate, there's a real clear pathway to addiction. And what Nehemiah shows us here in his prayer is processing well, that he does not, by saying that we're despised, by praying that Sanballat and Tobiah would not have favor, he's not punching down. He's not taking that out on the wrong people. He's not going off on some daughter of Jerusalem who doesn't put the wall together correctly. But you and I know that if we don't process our anger, we might very likely take our anger out or our frustrations out on a person that really did nothing wrong. This is like a byproduct of feeling that pressure and that weight. And so the invitation of Nehemiah 4 is not to pretend that any sense of opposition doesn't stick to you and that you're strong and you're resilient, but rather to say, hey, there's a space in the kingdom of God to process our pain in a real way, and that helps us to navigate the tensions of the moment. Followers of Jesus still very much feel pain. They still very much have doubts. They still very much feel rage sometimes, but how they carry those things out looks different in light of how they're loved by God. In the Psalms, we see Psalms of lamentation, which is expressions of grief, overt expressions of grief. In the moments of imprecatory Psalms, we see people praying that God's judgment would come down on enemies or people who have brought harm. And I have to confess to you that 9 years ago, one of the things for me that was so hard was that I was running and running and running from those things I had to confront. And that shadow self on July 31st, as everyone else went to bed and it just became about the brain I couldn't turn off, meant that I had to begin to process the reality and the gravity of the thing I was feeling. I needed to process that before God. I needed to process that amongst good friends who I had just been like positive and vision oriented with. I had to confess my fears. Number 3, we expect pivots. As we experience God, we also experience pivots. The truth is, in those initial prayers of Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah could have gotten like the 400-point plan. And even if he looked down at list number 302, even if he had said, hey, you're going to get halfway there and Sanballat and Tobiah are going to come against you, and then you're going to have to like put people with like their tool in one hand and a weapon in another, go. He would not have felt the weight of that pivot, but pivot he had to do. there was a moment where the plan and the execution of that plan had to change. The methods had to change to deliver the message that was the message of the book of Nehemiah. The walls of Jerusalem needed to be rebuilt. And so many times this year, I know that you know this, we've said the methods are things that so many times we get attached to. And it can often distract us from the message that that's the thing we actually want to hold on to. But we like our methods. We like our approaches. And a lot of times what we think in terms of God's will is that we'll just know the full picture. That we'll just get all 300 points and then we go. When the reality is to walk in the reality. When things get real, many times God's inviting us to pivot, to change a method or adapt a method in light of the message that we're trying to send. And so just as in that Friends episode where the character is yelling, pivot, pivot, as people are trying to turn a couch up a Manhattan flight of stairs to get into the apartment, it is painful and it is uncomfortable and it is frustrating for all of us to do this. But what Nehemiah's story shows us is that when things get real, God is often inviting us to discover new pivots. And the reality is transition kicks up. What are those new things that are made possible by the matter at hand? And that August 1st invitation for me was to say goodbye to certain methods that we had used in one place and to embrace this new season that God was putting in front of me. And as we pivot there, we also plan. We also plan. So in light of that, you've got people halfway building the wall when Sanballat and Tobiah are going to bring a great deal of harm, when suddenly you got to give them a weapon, and now there's a scheme being devised by Nehemiah, a good plan to say, hey, how do we not live in fear? Well, here's some ways that we're not going to live in fear. When I blow this trumpet, you know that something's on. It's going to get real. There's a plan to help the stewardship of the uncertainty and the fear. Boy, that sounds like something you and I could use right now, doesn't it? With so much uncertainty, what are the consistents that we can cling to? With so much uncertainty, what are the things that we can begin to put as inputs or metrics in our story that might remind us of that sense of purpose, that might remind us of a place to process our pain, that might remind us that it's okay to pivot? I think about a friend who created space for me every Thursday, two friends actually, who created space for me every Thursday in those weeks that follow to confess just how confused and cluttered my brain was. And they didn't offer 47 solutions. They just kind of heard and processed and helped me come back to that moment. To be honest with you, be part of a church during that time as we were planting a church was something that reminded me that God still was, that God was still working and moving, even in a moment where we were planting and starting something new. Those are inputs that were helping me kind of plan and prepare for the anxious moments that would follow those days that would follow in Baltimore. Sabbath rest was something that helped me carry the burden properly because I'm like a lot of you, and my default mechanism in crisis is just to work constantly and to operate under the fundamental belief that maybe I could work my way out of that hole if I just try hard enough. And the reality is I needed a different plan, one that said, hey, I need to go to bed and not work one day and see that God is still working in Baltimore, even when I'm not in my inbox scheming away. And lastly, to persist, to keep grinding. What I love about this story in Nehemiah 4 is that you can see it there in the end. Day and night, there's a plan to persist and to not let the opposition, which is getting real, come against them. And you know what? I just think about there's all kinds of things that Nehemiah cannot control in this moment. There's so much that's vulnerable, but what he could control and what the people of Israel could control, they did. And to persist in the things that we have some control of, these humble and small things, these minor things, even as small as they might feel, become a way that that greater story builds, unfolds, and accumulates. And so may we think about that today, even as we look at our moment. And there's still so much uncertainty. There's still so much we don't know. But there are things today that we can begin to cling to and be faithful in that we believe will make a big difference if we keep grinding and we keep pushing and we keep persisting in those particular areas. The reality, I think, of crisis is that so many times the lesser things scatter and the things that matter most draw near. And in a moment of great opposition, what I love in this story is that I see, Nehemiah clinging to God in new and fresh ways. And something I know about my life, every time things get real, is I love my plans, I love my preparations, and I don't love pivoting very much. But every time things get real in my story, the presence of God shows up in new and fresh ways for me to receive and walks with me consistently through the inconsistency. And today, if you're feeling like things are just getting real in your relationships, in your vocation, in making a difference in the world around you, may you receive the presence of God in a new and fresh way today.